From Luke's 14th chapter come these words about humility and pride. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, people were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move higher up. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And Jesus said to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So ends the reading of God's holy word.
Thanks be to God.
Invite us to pray. Eternal God, we direct our attention to the sacred text from Luke's Gospel. And we try our best, especially in a world which values success and promotion and being first. We try our best to listen to these words about being humble and letting others go first, placing others before us. Help us. This is not an easy text. It's not an easy task. So we listen with open spirits, hoping that our lives may be blessed in the hearing. This we ask in your holy name. Amen. Well, I've said it before, but it's a darn good thing that Jesus is there wherever two or three of us are gathered, because we need him. And when there are more than two or three gathered, we really need him, because things can get interesting, especially when people start to jockey for position, which we often do. People are funny in groups. Of course, there are groups of all sizes. They're big groups and they're small groups. The smallest group I've ever been in was a group of one, me. And usually there's very little jockeying for position in a group of one, unless you really have an overwhelming urge to get out ahead of yourself. In which case you might want to consult a professional. But groups larger than one definitely lend themselves to jockeying. I've shared this before, but it's a fun story. The largest group I've ever been in numbered somewhere around 500,000. 500,000. On the 4th of July, on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Funny thing, but I never caught the names of most of the people in my group. We didn't wear name tags. But even if we didn't know each other, there was a lot of jockeying going on. Somewhere well out of my view on that day, folks had gathered around a stage where, rumor had it, the Beach Boys were playing their music. And at one point, true enough, I could barely make out the strains of Good Vibrations through the warm night air. But I never, ever saw the band. In between me and the Beach Boys were a lot of people. And I got to figure that people, some of them, had either gotten there 6 or 8 hours before I had, or they had shouldered their way to the stage, or they knew somebody in Washington with connections. But however they did it, they got into those coveted places, right by the band. And there was a little bit of resentment in me about that. But I did take some comfort in knowing that I was in good company, because roughly 500,000 other people like me were standing in the hinterlands. Fact is, in most gatherings of any size, most people are in the hinterland. They're in the upper decks of the stadium, they're in the coach section on the airplane, or they're in the back of the church. In fact, it's very common in church to have most people in the hinterlands. Churchgoers are a very unselfish lot. They consistently surrender the front seats so that others might have the privilege of sitting there, even if the others never come. But church is generally an exception to the rule. Usually human beings want the good seats. Something delicious about being top dog, big cheese, head honcho, and grand poobah. Some folks will even go on TV and compete to become the world's biggest loser, so long as they can be number one at something. The allure of power and position and privilege is tantalizing, and Jesus knew it. And his message throughout his earthly ministry was consistently at odds with this human impulse to grab for the best seat in the house. Repeatedly, he tells us to be lowly, humble, and meek. And he kept spouting this maddening message about placing others first, leaving the biggest brownie for somebody else, waving another motorist ahead of him, setting aside some of our hard-earned cash for strangers. Crazy behavior that slaps the face of anyone who believes in survival of the fittest and the finest and the fastest. A whole lot of years ago, peace talks were dragged into a quagmire because the parties couldn't agree on the shape of the negotiating table. There's a lot of power conferred by one's position at the table. And they knew it. The head of the table has a prominent role. At holiday time, the head of the table often wields a knife. And the head of the table can decide what's to be eaten and when. Now, by contrast, and again, I've shared this one, so you're getting all kinds of recycling. But the most egalitarian meal I ever enjoyed was when 5 hungry guys, of which I was one, decided they were going to eat an apple pie. The catch was, nobody had a fork or a plate. So the solution was to lie down on the floor in a star pattern positioned radially around the pie, with each guy digging into his fifth with his fingers. As I recall, we all started and stopped at about the same time. That's very important. In a situation like that, you don't want to be slow. Then we all went to the men's room to wash up. Most of us don't eat our meals lying on our stomachs. But we eat nonetheless, and like every other behavior, eating can reflect our deepest values and our attitudes towards ourselves and others and God. We'll focus on eating for just a moment. Simple questions come up like, do we give thanks before we eat? Do we welcome others to join in eating with us? Do we wait until everyone's served? Do we pray for those who have little or none? Do we allow those prayers to filter down into our checkbooks so that others might be fed? All of these these are potentially very good spiritual practices that surround eating. Our service of Holy Communion that we just celebrated reminds us that eating is a fundamental human act that we share with every soul on the planet. And whether we're eating in a huge dining hall or we're alone in our kitchen, we are always at the table with our fellow passengers on the good ship Earth. Somebody's always eating, somewhere on Earth. Or they're not. And if they're not, Jesus seems to be issuing a call to us to make sure they do. Down at the fire hall in Bloomfield on Wednesdays, we usually set up 12 tables. And I know because I sometimes have the job of calling people up to those tables to get their food. We learned a long time ago that simply calling 60 people to come up to the food line is not a good idea, especially for folks that have a hard time standing for a while. So we call those tables one by one. And you wouldn't believe the intimidation and the bribing and the cajoling that goes on when I'm pulling those numbers out. I'm just pulling little pieces of paper with a number on it out of a plastic bucket. But folks get mighty suspicious. They joke with me that the whole thing is rigged. Well, I can tell you it's not. It's the luck of the draw. And there is no guarantee that those who are last this week will be first next week, kind of like the Bible. They might be last again. But whatever the order is, the tables are called. Nobody gets called until we do something else first. We pray. It's a short, simple prayer of gratitude. Either Rich does it or I do it, generally. But it's a little prayer that has the effect of collecting us, uniting us, pulling us together into one big table. Well, I want to close with an Olympic story that you probably all heard, but it's just too good to pass up. And some stories deserve to be repeated. And I think it illustrates the big table. The big table we all share. The table Jesus calls us to. There was an American named Abby and a New Zealander named Nikki. Now, how convenient is that? A for Abby, N for Nikki. American Abby, New Zealander Nikki. And they both tumbled to the ground in the women's 5,000-meter race. Abby apparently clipped Nikki's heel as Nikki was slowing down to avoid a third runner. And so the pair collapsed on the track, both injured. Abby got up but saw that Nikki was in distress and paused in a race to help her. They tried to continue, but Abby herself was in pain because of the injuries to her leg. Nikki tried to assist her, but Abby couldn't continue, and she urged Nikki to go on ahead. Nikki finished. And eventually so did Abby, who finished last. But only as measured by her speed, not her spirit. After the race, this is what Nikki said. I went down, and it was like, what's happening? Why am I on the ground? And she continued. Then suddenly, there's this hand on my shoulder, and Abby's saying, get up, we have to finish this. And I'm like, yeah, you're up, you're right. This is the Olympic Games, we have to finish. She goes on, I'm grateful for Abby doing that for me. That girl is the Olympic spirit right there. Jesus asks us to extend love to the crippled and the lame. Who'd have thought the crippled and the lame would show up in an Olympic race? They did. The opportunity to serve can crop up anywhere. The chance to extend a hand to another, to place Him ahead of ourselves. And so, to bring Christ more vividly into the world. Praise be to God.